I'll put them down here.
Ooh,
Yeah, you can't look directly at us. You have to watch us through the screen.
What's the advantage? I guess you get to see what it looks like.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it looks surprisingly good. It's not that good, but it looks good.
That's exactly what Rory says about himself when he watches it back. Yeah. That's why we can't have the thing.
I do know what you mean. I see you looking up into the distance quite a lot on the podcasts.
Also,
that's just because you talk about guilt yields and he's bored.
Also, I don't know exactly.
Guess what my report story is, guys? 4.5% of GDP on interest repayments.
Please,
Crazy.
no.
Just servicing
Get away
pre-existing
from me when
debt.
you're doing
It's
that.
definitely underreported.
Hello and welcome to another TLDR News podcast. I am Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and today I'm joined by Ben Blissett.
Hello.
And Rory Taylor.
Hello.
Two of TLDR's, let's just say, lead writers. Yeah, we're happy with that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
sounds
nice. And in today's podcast, we are going to be discussing, in broad terms, the UK's foreign policy. This is sort of off the back of David Cameron's appointment as Foreign Secretary a couple of weeks ago, and what that sort of says about how seriously the UK takes foreign policy. But as is custom on this podcast, before we get into that, we are going to do underreported stories. So could we start with Rory? Let's just go
I thought you were
here
going to start
round.
with yourself there. And
No, let's start with
you
I
want to
think
save the best to last.
Of course.
Okay. My underreported story is from Central America, from Panama.
So Rory.
Panama of canal fame, obviously.
Great way of
It's
explaining
not
it.
really been like in the headlines, but over the last half year or so, there's been pretty big protests there. They started out in opposition to this copper mine, this massive copper mine that's in the country. And this extension, the government were extending the contract for a Canadian mining company for another 20 years. These protests started out as environmental protests, so people, obviously it has a negative impact on the environment. They're protesting against that, but it kind of developed into wider anti-government protests, generally about the contract, kind of alleged corruption in the issuing of the contract, and also the amount of money kind of being taken out of the country and going to this foreign firm. So that's the kind of backstory. What happened this week was that the Panamanian, is that right?
Yeah.
Panamanian Supreme
Sounds
Court struck down this 20-year contract as unconstitutional. So gave this big victory to these protesters who for months have been kind of calling for it to be scrapped. So it might sound a bit boring to some people, but it's got bigger implications. So firstly, it's a massive copper mine, one of the biggest in the world. It produces about 1% of the world's copper supplies, and it's now going to be shut down. It also produces, is behind about 5% of the country's entire GDP. So that's going to be a pretty big effect on Panama. But I think it's interesting because it plays into this wider struggle over resources that plays out over the entire world, but in particular in Latin America, because it's very resource rich. You've got this struggle between local people and governments and companies, the kind of environmental struggle, often with indigenous groups on one side and the government on the other side. But also this fight between governments and multinational companies about who has the right to extract these resources, who gets the profits from that, and where these things go. And South America, I know Panama, Central America, but let's say Latin America, is a real hotbed of these struggles. You've got lithium in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. That's a big one. I think we've talked about it before, possibly.
I think we talked about it in the context of Indonesia a while ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I always say this on the podcast, but I genuinely think this is such a good underreported story.
Thank you.
I think it touches on so many interesting things. And the point you're making about this, like there's this wider international dispute going on between essentially governments in resource-rich countries and the Western companies that are trying to extract them. And the consensus in, let's just say, like the 90s and 2000s was that the economically optimal way for these countries to extract the minerals was to get lucrative contracts with these big Western companies who have the expertise and the deep capital flows to extract these resources efficiently. And that consensus has collapsed in the past few years. And I think the most interesting case of this, by the way, is Indonesia, which is super minimal rich.
Yeah.
And part of the Indonesian economic model at the moment is to make sure that not just the extraction of minerals, but their processing and their refinement, all of that has to be done on Indonesian territory. And so that they don't just want to be used as a sort of extraction hub and then the expensive high value processes get done abroad in America or whatever. They want to be taking value at every point in the supply process.
There was, I can't remember who it was. I think it was a politician from Argentina or possibly Brazil saying we don't want to export Brazilian lithium to Germany so they can put it in German cars. We want to export Brazilian cars made with Brazilian lithium, or Brazilian car batteries made with Brazilian lithium, and sell them in Germany. They want to go beyond just being a source of raw goods, basically.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for that. I think that a lot of companies are seeing that there is a sort of gold rush when you first begin these partnerships with these like Western multinationals, but actually creating a sort of like sustainable economy of just resource extraction is really difficult, if not impossible. And actually an effective way of using those resources is to funnel them into developing your sort of industries further up the supply chain. I think this is also ties into the wider, like the green transition, and the fact that with the green transition comes this massive increase in demand for a whole load of minerals. I mean, copper is a really good example. Lithium is another good example. And that has created a sort of like a new geopolitics of energy, where instead of all of us fighting for oil and trying to secure oil supplies, we're fighting for these sort of like particular metals and also like the ability to process them. The last thing I'm going to say is I think there's a really interesting historical parallel with what happened to oil in the mid to late 20th century. And for basically, let's just say like 1900 until a couple of years after World War II, oil in places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the Middle East was basically drilled and exported by European countries. So the most obvious one is we had I can't remember what it was called, but the UK had the Iranian oil company. It's called something like that. I should really know the name, but basically that company just took Iranian oil and exported it to the rest of the world, but only gave very few dividends and proceeds to Iran itself. And there was this rise of sort of what you might call energy nationalism, beginning in really the 50s, beginning really with actually Nasser in Egypt. And eventually, by the sort of the end of the 70s, almost all of those big oil companies had either been kicked out of the Middle East or nationalized by the national governments. I mean, Saudi Aramco is another example of that. Saudi Aramco slowly took over from, I think it might have been Chevron, one of the US companies that was responsible for drilling in Saudi Arabia. And I think we are seeing something similar happen here as other minerals become as sort of like central to the global economy as oil was in the 20th century.
I mean, just on the Egypt point as well, that's the thing that kicked off the Suez Crisis, and the US didn't come to Britain's aid in that situation. They were happy with, or at least it was seen globally as that they were happy with Nasser, renationalising and not getting involved in that situation, or at least not enough to get involved. So maybe we'll see something, the consensus shift in a similar way.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think one of the reasons that happened, and one of the reasons that in some sense America could afford to take a humanitarian line on the Suez Crisis was because, and this is getting way too historical, so we have to move on at some point, but was because America has its own domestic source of oil.
Exactly.
And it wasn't as desperate for it as not just the UK was, but also other European countries were. So the other European countries, France is a classic example. But anyway, I mean, Italy is also another example, by the way. Italy had a sort of like energy relationship with certain North African countries for a while. But anyway, let's move on. The second, that was the longest unreported story ever.
Yeah. It's very well reported now.
What is your unreported story?
So, in sort of classic fashion, it's a UK one. Basically, the Telegraph's reported today that there is talk within the Conservative Party about possibly scrapping the conference next year, which is meant to be in October in Birmingham. Now, the reason behind this is that they're suggesting that the resources needed to hold the conference would be taking resources away from a possible general election campaign. So candidates, volunteers, etc., door knocking, they wouldn't be able to do that. They'd have to go up to conference. So it's lending credibility to the idea that the next election could be held at the back half of next year, possibly October, November, possibly even coinciding with the US presidential election. There are some people, they haven't actually said who is, that they've kept their sources secret. They haven't actually said who's reporting this, but they're saying that from a few sources, this is what's being suggested. Other sources are suggesting that they might just slim it down. So instead of having 3-4 day conference, it'll only be 1 day. But others are saying that it should still go ahead, because the conferences are where parties usually get quite a lot of their funding from, or quite a lot of their money. The Tory party conference usually gets in the low millions sort of net for the Conservative Party. And we did a video on this recently. The Tory finances aren't looking brilliant, party finances at the minute. So the idea of completely scrapping it, some are saying, is a bit ludicrous because they're going to need that money, not least for a general election. But yeah, at the very least, the takeaway from this is that there is some credibility to the idea that a later election next year is looking more likely. I think, if I had to guess, I'd say that they probably would just scale it down to a day. I can't see them scrapping it. I mean, the other advantage to this as well is that it stops all of these, fringe meetings where you get, people on the Tory right saying some wild stuff that gets all over the media and undermines the sort of central message. So, as we saw sort of this year. I think it's unlikely that they'll scrap it in totality, but I think it's very possible that they're going to reduce it to just be a day.
Yeah, it also suggests that, we've seen reports of this before, that the Tories are running out of money a little bit. They've got loads of donors moving away from them at the moment. Anyway, yeah, that's a good one as well. I think we should probably move on past it just because we don't want to spend forever doing underreported stories. I'll be quick with mine as well.
All the time.
Yeah, mine is probably it's the most boring of all of these, but it is underreported.
I noticed you started with even. And then jumped away from that.
And it is just the fact that, according to the OBR, we are going to be spending £100 billion next year, or even sort of this fiscal year, on just repaying interest on our national debt. And that might not sound too crazy, but actually that does sound crazy. It's absolutely absurd. And it's in part because we've borrowed in some pretty funky ways. I mean, the UK and Italy have been the two worst culprits when it comes to borrowing index-linked gilts, which is basically when you you borrow money and you promise that you will pay them more if inflation goes up. And that means that when inflation goes up, as it has recently, we don't get a sort of tax windfall. Inflation doesn't eat away at our national debt in the same way that it does eat like other countries. But it's also because the way that we did quantitative easing is, and this is so boring, but I'm going to try and rush through it. It's not going to really make any sense. But the way they did quantitative easing, which is basically when the bank bought up government debt, is they did it via putting Bank of England reserves in banks, and those banks then use those reserves to buy up the debt. And now that the Bank of England's base rate goes up, that just means that we're paying more money in interest immediately to those banks. And it means that the interest rates are not set by like market forces, they're just set by the Bank of England base rate. And in some sense, what I'm trying to communicate here is that this is entirely self-inflicted. This is the way we have set up, as a country, we've set up monetary policy in these terms. And in the 2000s, when we did it, when it was sort of the Bank of England was made independent in 1997, that was fine because the monetary environment was very, very nice. But we've set it up to really punish us during times of high inflation. And what's essentially happening is that the government is currently spending $100 billion, and that is 3 times as much as our defence budget. That's more than our education budget. It's more than any other individual ministry apart from the NHS, basically. And we're just paying that to banks just because of some quirk. Well, it's not a quirk entirely, but essentially because of some quirk of our monetary setup. And our monetary setup isn't permanent. We could change it if we want to. And the fact that we're paying such vast sums of money, I mean, it should make this into a political issue. Maybe it's too boring, so it won't become one. But I still think that that's just really interesting. And the fact that I think it ties into this wider trend of the repoliticization of monetary policy.
But if we were to change that now, presumably you'd still have to be paying, these exorbitant, amounts.
It wouldn't solve our fiscal problems, but it would go some way to doing it. And we need as much help as we can get. I mean, it would actually just be a sort of constitutional kerfuffle. And we'd get lots of accusations of sort of like the Bank of England no longer being independent, all that sort of thing. But the division between the Bank of England, between fiscal and monetary policy, is never as clear as politicians and bankers or central bankers pretend it is.
No one likes a constitutional kerfuffle.
Yeah, of course, you're not wrong. Anyway, so with that all being said, let us move on to the main part of today's podcast, which is just going to be about the UK's foreign policy. We decided to do it on this because, well, this is essentially a reaction to David Cameron's appointment as Foreign Secretary. I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is that, as many commentators have noticed, David Cameron doesn't have a great foreign policy track record. And it's a symptom of the fact that foreign policy is often sort of instrumentalized in UK politics as a means to achieving domestic political objectives. David Cameron's appointment is not because he's got a great track record on Israel-Gaza. It's because Rishi Sunak wants to pitch back to the blue wall. And I think you see this in how well our foreign policy is doing, i.e. it's not going very well. And I think that we're going to have to split this podcast up into different foreign policy areas. But I think the most obvious one to start with is Brexit, is our relationship with the rest of the EU. And I think the question I want to ask is, obviously things fell to a real low under both Johnson and then Truss. There was that famous Macron friend or foe comment by Liz Truss. And they've improved a little bit. under Sunak, would we say that? And I think I just want to ask basically Rory to start. Like, how much do you think they've improved? And do you think they'll continue to improve under Starmer, assuming he comes in?
I think they've undoubtedly improved under Rishi Sunak. I mean, the Windsor Framework is the obvious thing to point to in terms of post-Brexit relations. That was a big achievement. And James Cleverly, former Foreign Secretary, he was also Foreign Secretary under Liz Truss and possibly under, I can't remember who was Foreign Secretary under Boris Johnson. That's terrible. Anyway, my point is James Cleverly, he wasn't just Rishi Sunak's Foreign Secretary, he was there for a bit before, but James Cleverly kind of took this more, this warmer approach to like foreign relations with Europe rather than this kind of combative one. But so they definitely improved, but there's still moments where you can see the kind of the domestic British politics influencing how our government approach Europe. I mean, just recently we had this whole thing with the Greek Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak. That was really, I don't know. It almost seems like a kind of pointless thing to talk about, but I do think it is important because it shows that even when relations have been on a kind of upwards trajectory, there's still always this risk that things can deteriorate. And what Rishi Sunak did, I think, will have longer term implications. Well, maybe not that long term if he's not Prime Minister for that much longer. Sure. But when you frustrate and annoy a European ally, that might be good for your base at home, and especially if it's something about like the Elgin Marbles or the Parthenon Marbles. But that's one of the 27 European leaders that you will need to have on side if you want to come to any agreement with the European Union. Also a NATO leader, obviously. That it was a real kind of step back, I think, from the approach that he had been doing beforehand. But I think if you look at the kind of net, it's got to be an improvement on a year or so ago when he took over.
Do you think Ukraine has helped in that respect, provided like a sort of binding agent?
I think so, yeah, because there's always this thing that they can point to and say, look, we've been working with Europe, not inside Europe, we've been working with Europe on this and we'll continue to. And David Cameron said the same thing. He pointed to Ukraine as the prime example of British-European cooperation post-Brexit. And interestingly, the Telegraph did a headline on it which said, David Cameron says the UK should get closer to Europe, and it set off a load of kind of members of the Tory parliamentary party saying...
I didn't see that. That's interesting.
I mean, but it was a weird... They didn't like quote him. They just kind of said this is what he said, and then he didn't really say it. He just kind of talked up cooperation on Ukraine. But it set off a lot of the kind of Eurosceptic Tory MPs, kind of needlessly, I think. But... I think... going back to your point, I do think Ukraine, has definitely been this kind of unifying force.
And you mentioned that... I've got a question in a second for Ben, but you mentioned as well that that way you framed it is, with Ukraine, the UK was working alongside the EU, but not within it. Do you think that, the European political community, that Macron idea of having like almost a tiered Europe, and on the very outside, you have this wide political community, which is going to include people like, well, in the medium term at least, the UK, maybe Turkey, maybe a couple of other sort of like EU adjacent players. Do you think that will be a success in that respect if Ukraine has proven that we can work alongside but not within?
It's difficult to say. I mean, it's obviously, it can be a success in bringing people to the table. It doesn't necessarily mean anything will go further than that. I mean, I think the first European political community, they had everyone but Lukashenko and Putin, and it was this big success to bring all these people, including Armenia and Azerbaijan, together around the same table. But whether it actually, going forward, gets concrete steps in kind of the kind of periphery of Europe, whether we'll actually work on anything beyond just like it being a forum, I don't know. Is my answer.
Yeah, fair enough. And so Ben, I was going to ask you, so the first thing is, presumably we think Starmer will be in power in next year. Do you think, have you got any sense of where his foreign policy is going to go? How much do you think Starmer will sort of divert from the UK norm?
Well, I think with Starmer, his attitude to policy, both domestic and foreign, at the minute is trying to very much maintain the status quo, and it's very much trying to. He's come in as leader following someone who has tried to break the status quo, someone who's tried to separate Labour out from the sort of centrist British just centrist British politics of both the main parties. Starmer has done something completely different. He's trying to show that it's a return to normal. And I think on foreign policy issues, he's very similar on that. He's been really careful, especially on the Israel-Gaza situation, trying not to ally with one side more than the other. I mean, at times, sometimes when it first kicked off, he was very much pro-Israel. A lot of his statements are very pro-Israel. Then he started, he got some kickback for what some perceived as him endorsing war crimes with the Israel withdrawing or withholding electricity, water aid to Gaza. So he sort of pulled back slightly on that. But ultimately, that's just a demonstration of him trying to be very much a moderate, trying to maintain the status quo. And I think that will be his main aim if he becomes Prime Minister, especially on foreign policy. With the EU is exactly the same. I think he's trying to, he was nominally a Remainer, but has said that he doesn't want to try and revisit any of the Brexit arguments or anything like that. I think that, he wants to maintain the status quo as much as possible. I don't think he's going to be a particular break from the current Conservative government on foreign policy.
So I completely agree. But I think what's so interesting about this is in trying to maintain the status quo, I think Starmer was quietly and slowly discovering that the status quo is really unstable in terms of UK foreign policy. I mean, what is the UK status quo? So Israel-Gaza, historically, or let's just say for the last 20 years or so, the UK has been a pretty staunch supporter of Israel. But again, I think he found out that was politically untenable pretty immediately to be like a sort of absolute support of Israel. He rolled it back a little bit. Sunak, by the way, and Cleverly both did the same. I mean, they both started softening their language at least before Biden and Blinken started softening their language. They were more sort of in tune with European leaders, people like Macron, in that respect. The status quo on UK-EU relations, I mean, like, what is that? We've had maybe like a couple of months for Sunak to establish a status quo, which is sort of like a moderately peaceful, like, we're just going to stay alongside, but not really actually do anything together. And before that, for the 5 years before that, it was chaos. It was very antagonistic. I mean, that's not a stable, like, status quo either. There just isn't a status quo on UK-EU relations. And I think our other most important foreign policy relation is with America. And I don't think there's a stable status quo on that either. I mean, you get sort of the Johnson and Truss era, who are like super pro-US. But I think a lot depends on American domestic politics. I mean, if Trump comes back into office in 2024,
completely shake things up. Like,
there's no status quo. What does Starmer do there? But
I think
we didn't have to bother with Trump during the 2016-2020 presidency because we were so consumed by Brexit. That was our only foreign policy issue. But if Trump comes in, go on.
Well, I was going to say, on that, Theresa May very much tried to buddy up a little bit to Donald Trump when he was in. They were seen holding hands at the White House at one point. She was very much trying to...
It was early on though, wasn't it?
And it was relatively early on. But
things soured, didn't they?
They soured a little bit, but I still think that her main aim was trying to maintain, what she saw as a special relationship.
I think that was done through the lens of Brexit, where it was like, we're leaving the European Union now. We need to really prioritise this relationship with the US. It was still done kind of via Europe.
I completely agree. So I completely agree with that, and I think that the Brexit, this fundamentally, a lot of this comes back down to Brexit, and that Brexit completely crippled the foreign policy status quo, whatever that really was, which was sort of somewhere in between the US and the EU, and it pushed us right over to the US. This is why, by the way, I think David Cameron gets a bit too much stick for how bad he is at foreign policy. I think a lot of it just comes down to the fact that if Brexit had gone the other way, Cameron wouldn't have such a terrible foreign policy record. It's that Brexit went the way it did, and that immediately meant that David Cameron's main foreign policy, which was the golden era of China relations, was completely scuppered because the UK's only foreign policy pivot was to just get close to the US post-Brexit. But I completely agree, and I think this is the issue, isn't it? Is that post-Brexit, we've only really just Brexited in a way. We haven't really had time to develop a foreign policy, and we just don't know what it is. I
think as well, though, especially with the US, when Blair came in 97, he had Clinton for a little while, and then he moved on to, his opposite in the White House was George W. Bush, who didn't share his ideals as much, and he managed to forge quite a close relationship, and they were very keen on, UK-US relations. I think that Starmer, I think that he is likely to do similar, even if it is Trump next year. I think that his view of things is going to be very much US focused. I think that, he's very informed by the Blair era in the Blair years, and I think that his view to foreign policy will likely follow that as well. And I think that the US special relationship is going to be something quite important.
But I think Starmer, assuming Starmer gets in and Trump gets in, I think that will put Starmer in an incredibly difficult situation, because currently with Biden, Starmer, use Gaza as an example, Starmer's effectively been saying no to a ceasefire while Biden's been saying no to a ceasefire. And if the US changes tune, then it's plausible that a lot of the rest of the world will change their tune, including Starmer. But if you get Trump in, and the key thing with Trump is how unpredictable he is. If Trump starts cutting aid to Ukraine, rolling back support for Ukraine, there's no way Starmer's going to do that. He's going to suddenly have to work out how to kind of stand up for his own foreign policy rather than aligning with the US. I
think one of the issues here, quite fundamentally, is that in terms of our political instincts, and actually in terms of the sort of geopolitical reality that we live in, that's so pretentious, but what I mean by that is we just can't really follow the US. It's the natural thing to do post-Brexit, but actually things that in our interests just do more closely align with the sort of median EU country. I think Israel-Gaza was another really good example of this. The US just has its own interests when it comes to Israel and Gaza. It has obviously a very, very deep relationship, which is important for both international and domestic reasons to maintain with Israel. But the other thing is that and we've mentioned this before in this podcast, the US is just insulated from all of the negative externalities that could flow out of a sort of Israel-Gaza escalation. I mean, like if you get another refugee crisis, for example, the place that's most acutely affected is going to be Europe. Another sort of like ISIS style, I mean, that's unlikely, but some sort of destabilization, like say the Sinai Peninsula, and some increased risk of terrorism, the place that's most affected is Europe. And America has more power in the Middle East, but it's insulated from the worst potential consequences. And that's just where the interests just do cut in different directions. And also the domestic interests cut in different directions. Maybe not as starkly as they used to, but Starmer, supporting Israel is really politically difficult for Starmer. I mean, the polling suggests that maybe this has been overstated a little bit. His polling has stayed very, very strong, despite all that talk about Muslim voters ditching Labour. But the politics of domestic political incentives are very, very different for Biden and the Democrats. And I think you're right, by the way, that Starmer he clearly, in some sense, sort of imagines himself as a British Biden, or at least a British Democrat. There's a lot of ideological overlap between Britain, the UK Labour Party, and the Democrats in the US. But the Green New Deal, by the way, is the most obvious example of this. I mean, that is sort of copy and pasted from the Democrat playbook. But if Trump comes in, or even if sort of like domestic political currents push the Democrats to a different place politically, all of a sudden that relationship looks very, very tenuous. And even if Biden is re-elected, there will be a Republican in at some point, and assuming current political trends continue, that will just make the UK-US special relationship, or at least using the UK-US special relationship as a sort of buffer to our bad relationship with the EU, it will just make that an untenable foreign policy strategy. The other thing I think is that the Bush example is really interesting, and I think it's instructive in this case. I think the first thing it says that Bush is just not Trump. George Bush, just not Trump. Yeah. The other thing is that in many ways, Tony Blair's very close relationship with George Bush was his downfall. I mean, that is one of the reasons he ended up in Iraq. He fell out with a whole load of the UN over that sort of thing. He fell out with much of the EU over that. And he even got a fair bit of flack for his support of Israel. I think it must have been in 2004. When he followed the Bush line and sort of being unequivocal support for Israel. And I think that with those lessons in mind, again, that means that Starmer just can't do a Blair in that respect. He can't buddy up to the next US president in the same way that Blair did with Bush, because he must have learned from the Blair-Bush experience.
I think my point is that going back, Labour has quite that their prime ministers always end up buddying up to American presidents, whether that's for financial reasons as it was with Wilson, whether it was for sort of geopolitical reasons. They tend to do so. I think that they see them as Britain's closest ally, and you see that throughout the post-war era I know there's not been many Labour prime ministers, but with basically all of them. And a lot of it is kind of financial, but a lot of it also is, I think, ideological overlap. And that also happens when you have presidents in that aren't, that are from the Republican Party, that don't necessarily align with the Labour Party. And I don't see Starmer breaking that trend.
So I think that, the consensus here is that I think we all agree that Starmer's instincts will be to buddy up with the US, whoever it really is. And in some sense, that's continuous with the way that conservative leaders have behaved post-Brexit. But I think we also agree that in many ways, that if not unsustainable, that is at least a problematic strategy.
Sure.
And I don't really see a way out of it. I think that my personal way out of it would be to lean a bit more closely to the EU. I think that our interests just do align better with the EU. But I take your point about the sort of like the political realities and the fact that historically the US and the UK have had a special relationship, which Starmer will definitely want to maintain.
Specifically, though, Labour as well.
Yeah, of course, true. Yeah. Okay, so the last thing we've done Europe, we've sort of done the US, and related to that though is obviously China and the UK's China relationship. And this is especially pertinent because David Cameron's flagship foreign policy was what he described as the golden era of UK-China relations, and that it's almost like funny to think back to that time because we've obviously got all
we
those
have the pictures on screen of David Cameron and Xi Jinping in the pub.
I was just about to bring the pub thing up. Yeah.
And it was quite interesting, quite how stubbornly Cameron's administration pursued that policy. Because even at the time, Obama was talking about pivot to Asia. Obama put, for example, a lot of pressure on the UK not to join the Asian Infrastructure Bank in 2015, but Osborne and Cameron went ahead with it. And that policy obviously sort of collapsed. And it's easy to think. I mean, the natural. Let me just redo that. That policy obviously collapsed, and you might assume that's just because now everyone sees China in a very, very different light. But I think, as we mentioned a second ago, it was sort of because of Brexit, because actually Brexit meant that we didn't really have the sort of geopolitical capital to move that far away from the US, especially if we were already moving away from the EU. And so I guess what the question is here is like, in light of the fact that the US and China look like they're moving towards a sort of détente, I mean, not like a peace, but like a better space, do we think that there's any chance that Cameron can sort of resume his UK-China golden era dream?
There was, I think, just in the last few days, he did an interview and basically said that, obviously they asked him about, is that possible? And he said, the situation now is different to what it was 10 years ago or something, but which is kind of an easy answer to give to that question. But I don't think he's going to like overhaul the UK's China policy, the one that we had before he came back as foreign secretary. I mean, Rishi Sunak and James Cleverly were kind of there was always that tension between them and the more anti-China side of the Tory party, saying that Sunak and Cleverly and co were kind of too weak on China, but David Cameron, I think, effectively has that same kind of position as they do.
That happened in the campaign, didn't it? At least Truss attacked Sunak for being weak on China.
Where they, saying China poses a strategic challenge, but it's not. They don't call it a threat, So I don't think he's going to like tear up and rewrite the foreign policy on China. Really,
he also doesn't really have time.
No,
I mean, like it's not enough time to pivot anywhere.
No,
So the other thing, I guess, is, do we think that Starmer, I presume your answer to this is going to be that Starmer's going to follow the American line, but do we think that Starmer is going to pursue a softer policy on China? I mean, it feels like he wouldn't be as hawkish as Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, but I don't really know where that intuition is coming from. I just don't think he would be.
No, I don't really have much more to say other than, I think he'll follow the US line. I think that you're right. I don't see him moving in any particular direction, especially early on, because he's so concerned about shifting polling party unity, everything else. I just think doing some massive strategic shift, especially early on, doesn't seem.
No, I see what you mean, and I guess the implication there is it just depends on what the US does. And that's sort of the case. I think, by the way, this is another example of it's two things. One, it's a policy that was scuppered by Brexit, because I think there is a universe where if Brexit goes the other way, all of a sudden Cameron's like close relationship with China would have been sustainable. I think it would have been a point of tension in the US-UK relationship, but I think he could have been like a Germany, like maintaining really quite close like trading relationships, but not actually falling out with the US. I also think it would be interesting because it would have created almost like a pan-European consensus, because you would have the Germans with a commercial relationship. I mean, Macron talking about strategic autonomy, i.e. having like a relatively friendly relationship with China, independent from the US, and you would have had a sort of like a Cameronite conservative party pursuing at least quite friendly relationships with China. Would have made geopolitics very, very different. But I think this is another case where actually I do just think that our our interests align more closely with the EU than the US. Again, the US just can't afford to like decouple from China. It just has the industrial base, it has the like mineral resources, it has the economy to do it. Whereas I think Europe is quite quickly realizing, this is such a miserable podcast, but Europe is quite quickly realizing that it just can't afford it. And that especially if we all simultaneously try and do Green New Deals, we can't all just like reindustrialize. There's only so much demand for industry. There's only so much like space in the market. And yeah, I think that we're going to, much aspirational as it is, I think Starmer will quickly realize that trying to do a Biden style Green New Deal at the same time that Biden is doing a Green New Deal is going to be very, very difficult. But I think you're probably right in that his aversion to rocking the boat will probably mean that he doesn't get any closer to China. Anyway, or unless the Americans do. Anyway, that is, I think that's it. That's for the main body of the podcast. Yeah. And that takes us on to what should be hopefully cheerier and a bit more fun, which is the Global Leader Leaderboard. Okay, so we have the Global Leader Leaderboard, and we're going to go the same way we did underreported stories. So Rory, should we start with down and we finish on up, don't we? Because it's nice.
Yeah.
Let's go down. So who is going down?
I'm moving down Ulf Kristersson. I'm going to speak into my microphone. Ulf Kristersson, Swedish Prime Minister. He's one of the highest on there at the moment. I'm moving him down one.
You mean Mark Rutte? Yeah.
He happens to look like Mark Rutte and lots of other people. Anyway, so he's coming down for two reasons broadly. One was this week he had to condemn some comments made by the Sweden Democrat leader. Sweden Democrats are a kind of broadly far-right party in Sweden that isn't in the coalition but offers parliamentary support to the kind of right-wing government in Sweden. The leader of the Sweden, if I said Social Democrats at any point during that sentence, I meant Sweden Democrats. The Sweden Democrat leader, he made some comments about Sweden should demolish mosques and that kind of thing, kind of off the back of Geert Wilders winning in the Netherlands. And Ulf Kristersson had to come out and say, that's not on, we don't do that in Sweden. Yeah, he basically had to condemn this, but it's this tension between him and the people he relies on for support. They're also, the Sweden Democrats are also a larger party than he is, than his party is in government. And on top of that, polling is also looking pretty bad for his party, the moderate party, and his coalition allies. The Social Democrats continue to poll way ahead. Absolutely killing it. Yeah.
If you hear, we did a video, we're talking about, you hear lots of stuff about Sweden moving right, but the Social Democrats are polling like 40%.
Yeah, you kind of forget that the actual government is a minority government that kind of cobbled together coalition, whereas the Social Democrats just doing great.
I also saw that the latest polling suggests that the Sweden Democrats have now overtaken the moderates. Yeah, is that what you're about to say? I'm sorry.
I was going to say, well, it's fine. It's fine. Basically not looking good for him.
Poor Ulf.
But I'm not trying to make it seem like the government's going to collapse or anything, but I think the broad trajectory for him is that if an election came anytime soon, it wouldn't be good. Yeah,
the return of like Islam as a political issue feels so like 2015.
It does.
You know what I mean? It feels,
while you talk, I'm going to move him down.
It just feels so like there was a lot of chatter back in the 2010s about what's described as the clash of civilizations. It's that Samuel Huntington book about like how the main, it's not very like serious book, but the main like political battle is no longer between like communism and capitalism, but it's now going to be between like political Islam and like secular liberalism, whatever it's supposed to be. And that really just disappeared as a discourse in the last couple of years. And it's been a very sudden return.
I think it's the Israel-Gaza thing has really brought it up again.
For sure. Probably also the migration is a like, hot button topic.
So it'd just be a cycle, really.
Maybe.
Anyway, so that was my person going down.
That's good. Ben, who's your person going down?
Yeah, I'm moving Olaf Scholz down.
Again?
Down to the bottom.
Yeah, which I do think means he's at the very bottom.
Yeah.
So this is to do with the budget crisis at the minute and the fact that a top court has ruled that their funding for renewables breaks their debt limits. You're smiling slightly.
This is exactly, we talked about this last podcast, and this is exactly the reason he went down last week.
Oh, I wasn't on last podcast.
Oh,
no, he's been moved down twice for the same thing.
Double down. I think
it's probably fair to move him down twice for it, because it's quite a big deal.
It is quite a big deal. I also think it's created some quite funny moments with those. You saw the Greek Prime Minister telling him to sell his islands, Germany to sell their islands to solve their fiscal issue, which is a callback to the fact that, during the Eurozone debt crisis, the Germans told the Greeks to do the same thing. Yeah. I do think it's just the way that Germany is going to have to respond to the fact that for the first time in a very long time, its economy is basically slowing and it can't maintain the sort of like fiscal rectitude that it previously did. That's just such an interesting political question. Like, I don't know what happens to German politics in that context. Like, German politics has looked super stable for like 20 years, basically since the 2000s. There was the post-reunification like struggle in the 90s. But since 2000s, just been running great. Like,
I think it was the leader of the CSU, whichever one is the one in Bavaria.
Yes.
Yeah, he was saying that he's basically calling for an early election.
Is that the guy who was really popular?
Marcus?
Yeah,
Söder?
Marcus Söder. It's Söder. It's Marcus Söder.
He was calling for an early election, and I guess we touched on this. If the FDP kind of were to like drop out of the coalition, I guess that would be the result.
They would, but I think it's very unlikely. Just the simple fact the FDP are polling
nearly
below threshold. Yeah. So the Bundestag has a 5% vote threshold, and the FDP are polling like 5%. Yeah. So they basically said, no, we're not going to pull out. It's quite funny because their membership said you should pull out, or at least a significant fraction. And Christian Lindner was like, I obviously can't do that. I wouldn't have a party anymore. Yeah. If he was on the board, I mean, he should be going down. Christian Lindner, all of his sort of black zero dreams are going in the bin.
Yeah, kind of having the national leader, you do kind of project all the nation's problems on that one person. But,
it's true.
It's tough part of the job.
Okay, so my person going down is I've given him to you.
Oh yeah, I've got him.
I have, and I just feel like he should go on the board. I have Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah,
and I've got to make my biases clear here. I am super pro Macron. I think he's great, but his poll ratings are abysmal, and two of his ministers are currently suffering with corruption crises. He can't maintain parliamentary discipline. And the other things just aren't looking very, very good for him at the moment. So I thought I'd put him on the board and put him down, unfortunately. Gives me an excuse to put him up week after week.
Yeah. I mean, the good news for him is that he doesn't have to worry about re-election. He can kind of do what he wants for a few years.
But it's a bit worrying that he's sort of becoming a bit of a lame duck.
Yeah.
1 year into his second term, he's got 4 years left.
Yeah.
You can't be a lame duck for 4 years. That's a rule of thumb.
Yeah, I mean, it's this thing where second term without a re-election, that issue of re-election, he can kind of take on those big challenges like pension reform, possible constitutional reform. But, that is a big slog, and it's only going to mean tougher kind of political fights for the next 4 years.
And even if you do have constitutional quirks that can make you force things through, fundamentally, you have a limited amount of political capital.
Yeah.
And he's running through it at quite a rate, especially if he ends up forcing through the immigration bill, which I don't know if that's happened. I know it hasn't, but it looks possible. Okay.
But good to have him on the board.
Yeah, good to have him on the board.
Can't believe he's not been on there already.
No.
Yeah. Poor guy. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. So who's going up, Rory?
I will admit this is a pretty weak reason to put someone up. I'm putting Donald Tusk up because he...
the bluest eyes on the board.
Yeah. That's nothing to do with it. There we go. Get him up there. He is not quite yet Polish Prime Minister, but he basically, Politico do this European power rankings every year, and they just put those out yesterday, and he is, according to them, the most powerful man in Europe. Most powerful person in Europe, I should say. So I thought it's fair to put him up for that. But he's still waiting to become Prime Minister. There's an interesting thing happening now where President Duda in Poland, he has appointed a law and justice government again, but it's only going to last 2 weeks because they need to win a confidence vote within 2 weeks to last. But it's like this pointless thing just to delay him coming in.
I thought it's such a petty move.
Yeah.
Like, it's quite pathetic, actually.
Yeah.
And it's also just so redundant, like 2 weeks of delay.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah. But he'll be, I guess, Prime Minister by Christmas, probably, I suppose. Yeah.
It's a pretty good life, Polish PM. Ben, who is your guy going up?
Mine is Sadiq Khan going up.
Sadiq Khan.
I see him. He is there.
He is on there, isn't he?
Yeah,
good. Basically,
just imagine he's gone up.
Yeah.
His polling's some polling from YouGov came out yesterday.
Such a professional podcast.
It's all right. I'll fix it.
Shall I just carry on or?
No. Actually, it could be quite fun to carry on.
Yeah? Shall I keep
Go on.
So basically, there was some new YouGov polling yesterday, and it put him at a whole 25-point lead over the Tories. So it puts Susan Hall, who's the Conservative candidate for mayor next year, at 25%, puts Steve Khan at 50%. Obviously, the voting system has changed. So
do you want to explain that a bit more? Because I think that was a story that got really underreported when it happened, and it was really, cheeky as underplays it. It feels sort of constitutionally illegal by the Conservatives.
So it's now first past the post.
Yeah.
Previously, it was proportional.
Yeah.
And previously, if you didn't get 50% in the first round, you would reallocate to the second round, so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, your second preference votes. Yeah,
second preference. Yeah. So that is obviously supposedly better for smaller parties. It's supposed to be more representative. The larger parties are the ones that will mainly benefit from first past the post. But to my knowledge, there wasn't a referendum or anything else that on it. It was just unilaterally sort of changed.
They just changed the voting system because they thought they had a better chance of winning on the first past the post.
Obviously the UK doesn't have a codified constitution. There's no legal requirement to put these to a referendum. But usually in the European context, constitutional changes require
any
a referendum.
developed country, that's what you can't just change your electoral system.
Which is why we had in 2011 the AV referendum to change the way it's proposed that we would change the way the general elections work to the AV system. That's why we had a referendum on it, which we said no to.
Also, I think they've avoided controversy because it looks like Sadiq Khan is going to win again, so there won't be some sort of dodgy outcome. But had Susan Hall, if Susan Hall wins via first past the post, and it becomes increasingly apparent that she only won because of first past the post, or at least that was a necessary condition to her winning, then you can imagine there's going to be a fair bit of uproar, at least amongst London Labour voters.
It's amazing because whenever the government seems to change anything constitutionally to supposedly be in their favour, such as the new voter ID requirements, it seems that afterwards it's actually got even worse for them. It's a 25-point lead for Labour at the minute, and voter ID laws, I think that came in right before some by-elections that they lost, and it actually turned out that it was older people who were more affected, who were more likely to vote Tory because of the voter ID changes. So I suppose the lesson here is don't mess with things constitutionally.
But it is that, you see my point there, is that so far we've avoided some sort of uproar about it because the results have been uncontroversial. But they've done a lot of constitutional fiddling, a lot of electoral fiddling, and in a different universe, or even one where this all gets a bit closer, you could see that being a massive point of tension. That would be like a proper constitutional issue. We could be a little bit of a deadlock. Anyway, so far we've avoided it, and it looks like, according to polling, controversy will be avoided and Labour will have a stonking great majority everywhere. So the next bit is my guy who's going up.
Oh God, we'll do more.
Controversially,
don't break it this time, please.
Okay.
Not actually that controversially once I give the reasoning, but mine going up is Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who at time of writing is still Israeli Prime Minister, and I think that is why he's going up. Two things are true. First, that his polling is appallingly bad, and at least the polling that came out sort of in October suggested that the majority of Israelis did want him gone. And there was a sense that he was only going to hang on until the war sort of finished, but we've had a truce. The truce is pretty tenuous, but it's held for a couple of days now, and Netanyahu is still in post. And the other thing that's worth saying is that historically, basically, these sort of security crises have normally led to the downfall of Israeli prime ministers. And the fact that, again, Netanyahu is still in post is quite impressive. And he really is a political survivor. But he's one of those political survivors who's a survivor in the sense of that they just never say they're going to go. It's like Boris Johnson was a survivor. It's just because he sort of stubbornly sat in office. And Netanyahu is sort of doing the same thing. But the fact that he's still in post, I think, is enough to put him up the wall.
Yeah. If the requirements now are just that the person remains in post for us to move them up, it's going to make my sort of job easier to find people to move up in the next few weeks.
It's going to be a very busy top of the wall.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that is just about everything. Have I missed anything?
No.
I think we're done.
We've done unreported stories, the main bit, and the leaderboard. Okay, well, that's everything. So thank you very much for watching. And we will see you again, not just next week, but we'll actually be doing, this is a last minute plug, but we'll be doing 2 podcasts next week because we have decided that we're going to be doing a UK podcast and a global podcast.
Should be noted, though, that you might not find them here anymore on the podcast channel.
Another good point. You will not find these podcasts here. You will find them on... Cameras are changing. You will find them on the UK and global normal TLDR channels, respectively.
Which will be linked.
down below. Cameras are still changing. All right, that is everything. Thank you very much for watching / listening, and hopefully see you twice next week.
Bye-bye. Good.